Hey folks, this is JR with DIY Prepper. Welcome to the channel, and today we're going to be talking about how to get the most out of your dry food storage, and then also some things that you can do to make the process of storing those dry foods a little bit easier. And in this video, we're going to be using products from Wallaby Goods, so I like to thank them for sending us some of their bags and their oxygen absorbers to use, and for sponsoring this video. And I'll put links in the description below so you can check out the products that I'm using today. And when using Mylar bags for long-term food storage, thickness does matter. You want any bag that you use to be at least 5 mil thick, and there's a couple reasons for that. First of all, bags like that, they're going to be durable, they're going to be more puncture resistant, but they're also going to do a much better job protecting the food inside of them from light. Light is something that can degrade your food storage over time, and having bags that are at least 5 mil thick are going to keep that light from getting to your food. And all of the bags that Wallaby offers, they are at least 5 mil thick. Some are much thicker, like this one is the Gusseted zippered 1 gallon bag, and it's 7.5 mil thick. And most of us know that when we use Mylar for long-term food storage that we're going to need oxygen absorbers as well. But y'all, it is so easy to find bundles nowadays, like those offered by Wallaby, that include the bags, they include oxygen absorbers, they include labels, that I really don't think that there is much of a reason to buy bags that do not include oxygen absorbers. So my next tip is always try to find bundles whenever possible. Then it's also important to remember that not everything does require oxygen absorbers. There are things like salt and sugar that if you use oxygen absorbers with them, they're just going to turn hard as a brick bat over time. And that also extends to other kinds of foods, things like Jell-O powder. Since it has such a high sugar content, if you put one of these in your bag with your Jell-O, it's going to turn hard just like sugar would. And then for things like Tony's Cajun seasoning, it's going to do the same thing because it has such a high salt content. And another important thing to remember when using oxygen absorbers is that they only absorb oxygen. And oxygen is only about 21% of the air that we breathe. The vast majority of it is actually nitrogen. So the reason why I bring that up is you may use the properly sized oxygen absorber in a bag, but it might not look shrink wrapped like what you would expect it to. Like this bag, it's pinto beans. I only had a little bit left, so that's why it's not all the way full. But you notice it has the shrink wrap texture that I think a lot of us want when we're using Mylar and oxygen absorbers for long-term food storage. But this one right here is instant coffee, so, freeze-dried coffee. I use the proper size oxygen absorber in this as well, and it still looks like it has some air in it, which it probably does, but it's probably nitrogen. The oxygen in here has probably been absorbed exactly the way that it should be, but since most of air isn't actually oxygen, that's why it looks like there's still something in here. Now, of course, it probably doesn't hurt anything to use extra oxygen absorbers, but you don't really need to, and it may just end up being wasteful. Another important thing to remember about storing food in Mylar bags is that it needs to have a moisture content of less than 10%. Things like salt, sugar, beans, like I have some dried rice in this bag. Those are all perfectly fine, but other things like raisins, anything else that may be dried but still has a considerable moisture content are things that you want to avoid because botulism is a bacteria that can thrive in high moisture, low oxygen environments. And unfortunately, it's one of the deadliest bacteria out there, so you definitely don't want to mess with it. And that is the reason why I do not freeze my food before I put it in Mylar. The reason why a lot of people want to freeze their food before they prepare it for long-term food storage is that that freezing process will kill things like insect eggs so that they don't have to worry about them hatching. But the problem with that is whenever you take something out of a very cold environment and put it somewhere that's warmer, especially much warmer like room temperature, then the water vapor as it's going through the air is going to condense on that. The same way that when you take a soda can out of the fridge, it starts sweating. It's not sweating. Water vapor is condensing on that surface, and the same thing can happen with food as well. So if you put food in there that's moist, then you could have those botulism concerns. Now, It might not be, in some cases, enough to cause that to happen, but oxygen absorbers are going to do a good job of killing those eggs all on their own. So as long as you use properly sized oxygen absorbers in your bags, you don't have to worry about those insect eggs, larvae, or whatever becoming a problem because they're going to be starved of oxygen anyway. And when storing dried goods, you're going to need a good water storage plan. Things like dried beans and dried rice can require quite a bit of water to prepare, so you're going to need enough water to be able to do that, also enough water to drink daily, but then have some also for things like cleaning tasks. You need to have plenty of water stored on premises, but also have the ability to procure additional water as time goes on. Something like rainwater catchment's a good idea, even if it's not something built into your home, like something like tarps and totes. Maybe you know where a nearby water source is that may still remain clean during the course of a disaster. But you also need to have ways to purify that water. Of course, countertop water filtration units are always a good idea, but have plenty of fuel on hand that you can boil water if necessary. And that leads me to my next thing. Have multiple ways that you can cook off grid because, once again, those dried goods, you are going to have to heat them in order to cook a lot of them. Things like propane or butane camp stoves are a good first option, but it's also important to have some backups, even if it's something as simple as an alcohol stove or maybe something that burns natural materials, something like a rocket stove that you can just burn twigs and pine cones in. That'll allow you to use natural materials to prepare all the dried goods that you've stored, because if you don't have a way to prepare this food, then it's really not going to do you any good when you need it. And one thing I've experienced when transferring food over from its original packaging over to a Mylar bag is that don't go out and buy yourself a scoop for that. That's one thing I did the first time that I used Mylar bags for food storage. And the second time, I just used a small plastic cup that my kid got as part of a kid's meal, and it works so much better. Because with the cup, you don't have to worry about the food spilling over the sides, and since most of them are plastic, you can kind of bend them into the shape that you want them to be when you're scooping and pouring. So don't spend the money on a scoop, just use a plastic cup while you're transferring that food. And another kind of personal recommendation that I have when storing food in Mylar is that the bags that are gusseted and they have zippers, they're a lot easier to work with than the bags that don't. First of all, since the bags are gusseted, they're going to stand up on their own so that you can open them up, kind of have them standing, and then you can just pour food into them without having to worry about them falling over and spilling everything you just put in. And then having a zipper at the top, that's going to allow you to seal it most of the way, drop an oxygen absorber, close it off, and just seal it up a lot easier, because when you close the zipper, then the top that you seal off is going to be right up against each other, nice and flush the way that it should be. So it just makes the whole process a lot easier. And it's important to remember that Mylar bags can protect more than just your food storage. So it's hurricane season. If something happens and there's things like pictures or other documents that you don't want to lose but you can't necessarily take with you, you can just slide them down into a bag like this, seal them the same way that you would if there was food, and it's going to do a pretty good job of keeping those things dry. Now, if you're worried about them getting punctured and getting damaged in some way, maybe there's like a flood or there's a hurricane, you're worried about storm damage, then you can always slip these down into a 5-gallon bucket like you would your food. And there's a lot of the bucket lids now that are kind of made of a nice kind of soft, flexible material. If you silicone those and then set them down on there, it's going to create a nice seal, and you can always take something like a utility knife and cut through those to retrieve your documents. Now, the bucket and lid, it's probably going to be a one-use thing, but between having it in Mylar and then having the bucket sealed in that way is going to do a very good job protecting the stuff inside. And one more thing that's important to remember with food storage in general is that you need to take into account any food allergies or food sensitivities in your family. So say you have somebody in your family that's gluten intolerant. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to store a ton of wheat berries or a ton of ground up white flour. You're going to need things like gluten-free pasta, quinoa, and there's a lot of other things that would allow those people to have the grains that they need in a way that their body can digest. And I did a full step-by-step video showing how to use Mylar bags for food storage. You can find that by clicking over here. And if you want to see just some general food storage or stockpile videos, y'all can click over here. Thank y'all for stopping by. Y'all have a good one.